Rick, why did you get interested in fasting and feasting?
Well, think about how extraordinary they are as behaviors. People have to eat every day, or they like to eat every day, or whenever they possibly can. And somehow, eating becomes ritualized in an extreme way when people fast and feast.
Why did you assume that fasting and feasting are religious behaviors?
Because you find those sorts of behaviors in one form or another all over, and they're all religious behaviors because they all involve the mandates, the traditions of ancestors. In other words, when particular cultural groups fast in a particular way, or they feast in a particular way, it's periodical, it's predictable, and it's done in a way where that society has been doing that for many, many, many generations. In other words, it's traditional.
How does evolutionary theory distinguish fasting and feasting from other behaviors?
Well, fasting and feasting are different because even though they're religious behaviors that are predictable and they're inherited from ancestors, and that's why they call them traditional behaviors, fasting and feasting are somewhat different because they're done in order to test people's level of sacrificing. How much are they willing to cooperate in behaviors that are extreme? Because fasting is a matter of denying yourself food, and it's not an easy thing to do. In feasting, what I argue is that costly signaling is implicated, not by the people who do the eating, although they may or may not eat too much, but it's done by the people who supply the food because it's expensive. And in some civilizations, this sort of feasting has been ruinous for the people who supply the food. In biological communication, circumstances arise in which organisms benefit by signaling one another. This occurs when the signals contain information helpful for the survival or reproductive success of both sender and receiver. The premise is that signals will be perceived as reliable only if producing and sending them are recognizably costly. Religious fasting and feasting, widespread in human populations, are well fitted as costly biological signaling. Like all traditions inherited from ancestors, food-related behaviors have a variety of functions other than just nourishment. Fasting and feasting are costly, reliable signals that may confer advantages within the dynamic sexual selection marketplace. When individuals take part in community-sanctioned religious events, such as feasting and fasting, they demonstrate a willingness to cooperate with others in the traditional practice of rituals. Here is William James on the value of sacrificing. In the religious life, surrender and sacrifice are positively espoused. Even unnecessary givings up are added in order that the happiness may increase. Food acquisition by hunting animals was often a collective activity, rewarding the hunters most responsible for the hunt's success. The leader of successful hunts was entitled to eat and distribute a disproportionate share of the meat. The need for cooperation in hunting and gathering gave rise to the widespread social consumption of food that, when attached to religious ritual, achieved sacramental status. Because food scarcity has been rampant in human history, communal rules for sharing food are found everywhere. Because our social species evolved the inhibition to not eat alone in front of others, one who eats in public must share food with the others who are present. A benefit of food sharing is the reduction of costs associated with social living. There are few behaviors about which people are more aware than the eating patterns of family and neighbors. Slander, gossip, and ridicule, the age-old weapons of social denigration, often concern themselves with the eating patterns of their targets. Like the sharing of scarce food, fasting can sacrifice one's short-term welfare. When individuals share the sacrificial fast, temporary food denial communicates honestly a willingness to cooperate. In addition, the handicap of fasting reliably displays one's healthfulness and vigor to both potential mates and competitors for those mates. Non-food stringencies are sometimes added to the fast, like prohibitions against bathing, shaving, wearing jewelry or attractive clothing, and working to earn money. In medieval Catholicism, renunciation of food and drink were examples of the courageous asceticism considered saintly. Monastic orders use fasts, such as giving up meat for Lent, to decrease sexual desire, to promote celibacy, and mortify the flesh. Fasts were undertaken to expiate one's sins or those of society as a whole. On the other hand, the Church considered fasting a mockery if done to promote health. or beauty. Because powerful men have used food as a weapon to control others, one might expect fasting to reflect subordination. However, as Mahatma Gandhi demonstrated, the self-discipline of fasting can raise rather than lower one's public esteem. Religious fasting perhaps mimics illness fasting. Since people and animals stop eating when they feel sick, fasting long ago became associated with curing illness. When communities experience food shortages, the customs of religious fasting may have developed to make virtue of necessity. Fasts of up to 3 days were used to diminish the hunger drive. Also, herbs are used to suppress hunger. Cocoa leaves are chewed by native Andeans to inhibit hunger and fatigue. Peyote, tobacco, coffee, and tea have likewise been used to blunt the appetite. In many cultures, prolonged fasting is a way to induce heightened awareness. The delirium that accompanies extended fasting, though viewed fearfully, can promote a person to become the community visionary. Buddhism promotes periodic fasting as an invigorating ascetic practice. Among the Algonquin tribes, rigorous fasting was required of boys and girls from an early age. It was expected that these fasts would induce dreaming and other visions that would shape the character of each youngster. Now let's discuss the nature of feasting. As Arab historian Ibn Khaldun wrote, "When a great man gives, it is a sign of magnanimity. When a poor man gives, it is a sign of his bondage." Food generosity is judged as a sign of good character. Rationing food to subordinates has been an effective way to maintain power. Prestigious donors must provide the food for communal feasts in extravagant quantities. Dinner parties and imperial banquets in ancient Rome were excessive to the point of vulgarity. On religious holidays, Roman governments recognized the importance of public feasts to entertain and provide food to the hungriest segments of their population. At religious feasts, sacrificing of animals was followed by communal consumption of the meat. Early on, wealthy Romans were leery of the Greek preference to serve fish rather than meat at their banquets. They changed their opinion once they realized fish dishes could be just as lavish for the conspicuous display necessary for a feast. 16th century banquets in Italian courts were extravagant multimedia events given to astound and overwhelm the senses. The feast could consist of 5 courses of between 15 and 19 dishes each. Who was invited and who excluded was a topic of great interest. Even the seating arrangements reflected the social hierarchy. To emphasize the segregated seating, better food was served to the elite guests in plain sight of the less privileged. Ostentatious feasting has persisted in many cultures to celebrate marriages. Wedding feasts promote a family's social position. Those with the good fortune to be marrying off a child are expected to lavishly display their generosity. Finally, some conclusions on fasting and feasting in evolutionary perspective. Although these ritual behaviors might at first glance appear self-sacrificial, from a costly signaling perspective, it may be just the opposite. Individuals who display their self-control by conspicuous fasting are respected for submitting to the discipline. Since people pay attention to the eating habits of others, religious fasting is always done in public view and never concealed. On the other side of things, anorexic behavior is tainted with shame and deceit due to its secrecy. Public fasts can be seen as competitive asceticism, increasing an individual's long-term value even as short-term fitness is decreased. In our evolutionary history, it was helpful to detect who was actually starving and who was feigning hunger to arouse pity and get more food. Although anyone can engage in ritualized fasting, those with the most resources have the most to gain because their sacrifice is greater than those lower in the pecking order. For our social species, shared experiences like fasting and feasting gave selection advantages to religious populations able to sustain cohesion under trying circumstances. My purpose in this presentation has been to label fasting an act of approved self-denial and feasting an opportunity for elites to donate large quantities of food to those whose welfare they care little about. Reputations can be significantly enhanced by religiously sanctioned fasting and food donation for feasts. Those who cooperate communally are applauded for their generosity. Their enhanced prestige will, on average, result in greater than average descendant leaving success. Thank you for tuning in.